It's my pleasure to welcome Alon Hafri. I see the nasals always catch me. Alon Hafri. He's assistant professor at the University of Delaware. I came from Delaware, and I feel like this kinship. I thought we got to invite Alon to come talk about his research. And also, I wanted to invite Alon because his research is exactly the kind of interdisciplinary stuff that I think we all love. It's at the intersection of language and vision. How do we navigate mentally between the structure of language and the structure of vision, which can be structurally very different kinds of things. And I find that really, really intriguing. Alon got a bachelor's at Wesleyan, did a master's and PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked under John Shrewswell. In 2019, did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins with Chaz Firestone and Barbara Landau. The credentials are there. Very legit. Now you're assistant professor at the University of Delaware. I hope you stay. You're only a hop, skip, and a jump away from us. I think that's really cool and fun. So today you're going to talk about how language and vision interact and meet each other, how we navigate between these structures mentally. Take it away, Alon.
All right. Well, thanks, Ryan, for the great introduction. And yes, we are kin, so this is great. So, I visited Rutgers way back as an undergraduate around 20 years ago. Here's the evidence. Ignore the facial hair. That was a different time. So while that visit was fun, I really have to say this visit has been fun so far in a very different way. Because, I'm really honored and privileged to be sharing this work with an audience that takes the project of cognitive science seriously, that appreciates the insights and approaches from the different areas of our field and how they can inform one another. So I'm just really excited to talk to all of you. I left that on way too long, excuse me. So my background is in these two areas of cognitive science, language and vision, and they really stand out, among others, as really core to our field. They've been engines of progress from the beginning. And they're traditionally treated separately, and that's for good reason. So the computational goals of language and vision they're very different. So you might think that a primary goal of language associates an utterance, like the cat is on the mat, with a meaning, and so it traffics in rich, structured representations to get there. And vision is about taking sensory data and, through a sequence of processing stages, forming a representation of the external world. So as a consequence of these different goals, the computational theories must also be different. But in the end, language and vision must connect. After all, we can talk about what we see and we can recognize things people are talking about. So visual input must be translated into a format that language can use, and vice versa. Now, I'm not the first to have pointed this out, so many have recognized that this is the case. But in my lab, we hope to build on these insights by asking how these systems connect, what kind of information they share, and how they do it. And one answer is that the connection is quite shallow. So vision provides the initial low-level primitives, so colors, textures, shapes, objects, and locations. And the rest of the mind, higher-level cognition, does the rest. So you can think like, oh, there's some cat stuff here, some mat stuff there. There must be a cat on a mat. And this makes the kinds of representations, the kinds of principles of these systems very different. But I think the relationship goes quite a bit deeper. So in today's talk, I'll show you that there are surprising parallels between how these systems represent their information, so their content and their format. And as I'll briefly discuss at the end, I think that these parallels have some really fascinating implications for how we might think about the connections between language and vision. So, for example, perhaps nonlinguistic cognition or even perception might constrain the kinds of hypotheses that learners are entertaining when they're learning the meanings of words in their language. And so that's what I'll be talking about today, parallels and connections. So in the majority of the talk, I'll focus on work where we leverage insights about how we know language works to ask about vision. And we'll show that vision represents some surprisingly sophisticated content and in an abstract, structured, and even compositional manner. And at the end of the talk, I'll circle briefly back to language and explore constraints on what kinds of meanings learners language users can learn to use and represent, and potentially how non-linguistic cognition might constrain those kinds of meanings. If that's not clear, it'll become clear when I get to that section. And a key takeaway from this, I think, is that I think that language and vision share core aspects of representational format and content. And I think that's a format consistent with Jerry Fodor's original language of thought hypothesis, and that is a hypothesis that your own J. Quilty Dunn and colleagues expanded and discussed in the realm of the rest of cognition, including perception. As an aside, I think there's some sort of a really exciting feedback loop that's happening. So in their paper, they discussed some of the work I'll share today. And in turn, their paper actually inspired me to think about this in some new ways that have inspired later work that I'll tell you about in the talk. So I hope that continues. So in the first couple of parts of the talk, I'll talk about parallels between language and vision in terms of representational format. And I'll illustrate my approach by showing you this image and asking you, well, what do you see? You don't have to answer that question, I'll tell you. So certainly we see the colors, the textures, the objects and locations, but beyond the objects themselves, you probably also appreciate something else, and that there is a cat on a mat. There's one thing on another. In other words, you appreciate how those objects relate. Now, relations are core to language research, but they don't appear so much in vision research, and you can sort of see why. So, although the cat and the mat themselves both stimulate the retina, they form a part of the retinal image, there's no part of the image that you can point to and say, that's the on part of the image, without the objects themselves, right? So it would be reasonable to think that this onness is just in the realm of higher level cognition about this image. But notice that a lot of the same machinery that's traditionally associated with representing sentences might also be used for representing relationships like this. So the cat is on the mat shares a similarity to a sentence like the mat is on the cat. There's a difference in structure, though. Even though it's the same words, the way those words are structured leads you to a different interpretation. And you could think about visual images of relations as involving the same kind of thing. So these are both a cat and a mat, but the relationship between these objects is very different. As a side note, this was my kitten at 3 months old. I did not bribe it, I promise, to have this mat placed on it. It was just sleeping. So sentences also have abstract elements. So these three sentences here share some element in common, and that's on here, even though the entities that are participating in the relationship are very different. And likewise, you can have this happen for visual relationships. So in all three of these, there's a commonality, despite all the differences in objects and visual features. And that is there is one object on top of another. The mind appreciates the similarities between all of these images. So structure and abstraction together for a representational scheme called role filler independence, and that's the capacity to bind arbitrary entities to distinct roles. And that can give you a lot of flexibility and generalization to represent things you might never have seen before. So the plate is on the cookies, the table's on the book, but also the Scarlet Knights are on the cantaloupe? I don't know. That's your mascot, right? Okay, good. Now, the question is, does anything like role filler independence appear in visual processing? And by that, I mean that very literally, that vision is doing the work here, inferencing. So how can we know? Well, one way people have approached this is just ask people what they see. But I think that our approach is slightly, I would say, slightly better, because we're actually asking whether we can find effects in visual processing itself. So we're going to ask whether we can find an influence of these relationships on fast, easy visual tasks that have nothing to do with visual relationships. So if we can find evidence that relational information is creeping into people's judgments on fast, easy visual tasks, then that suggests to us that visual processing is involved and automatically encoding the relationships. So I'll start with relational structure, and I'll look in the context of events, or who did what to whom. So this is work done with John Shrewswell and Brent Strickland. So if you look at this image, you certainly can see the colors, the objects, and you might even notice that there's some pushingness happening in this image, right? But beyond that, you recognize that there's a boy pushing a girl and not a girl pushing a boy. And that's what I mean by extracting relational structure, identifying which person is performing which role. So inspired by the study of semantic roles in linguistics, I'm going to use the term agent to refer to the boy here and patient to the girl. And these roles are abstract. They generalize across events. So in this event here, we have the boy as the agent and a ball as a patient, even though it's very different kinds of events. So what is the role of visual processing in affording this relational structure? Well, one possibility is that the structure emerges only from deliberate reasoning about this scene. So, there's a boy here, the girl there, he's standing in a certain way. The boy must be pushing the girl. Or perhaps there's some sense in which relational structure also emerges rapidly and automatically simply from attending to the individuals in the scene. And we're going to empirically test that possibility here. So the experimental logic goes like this. We show a continuous sequence of images of two participant actions, and on each one, people do a super simple task. Where's the blue person? Here, they would press the left button because he's on the left. So here's that logic I was describing earlier. We have an easy judgment that has nothing to do with the event itself. It's just, where's the blue guy? Is there an influence of changing the relational structure, who's the agent and patient, on these judgments? If so, we can infer that people were automatically encoding that relational information, even though they weren't required to do so. So to break it down concretely, imagine on one trial the target individual is the agent, and on the next trial he repeats being the agent. So there, his role has repeated. But you might also see that the roles switch, so now it goes from being an agent to a patient. What we expect in this task is that we should see faster responses when his role repeats than when it switches, even though the task has nothing to do with the relationship. So we're going to call that a role switch cost. You can think of it as a repetition benefit. So we used 10 different events. They were fully counterbalanced. Each appeared with the agent on left and right, et cetera, et cetera. And I want you guys to now try this task yourself, just to experience what it was like. So your job is to tap your leg for the blue on left, tap your other leg for blue on right. Yeah, left. This is very unclear. I don't know what's going on here, but tap your left hand for left, right for right, okay? Here you go. Give it a shot. Somebody stomped? That's okay. You're learning. Left. Okay, left. All right, so your experience was probably that was very easy. Our participants were very fast and very accurate at this task. The question is, will they be slower when the roles switch, when the relationships switch across trials? So on the y-axis is what I call the role switch cost. Higher up means that there was a cost when the role of the target person switched from one trial to the next. And what you see is, yes, people took longer to respond when the event role switched, even though the task had nothing to do with that information. And almost every subject and every category of event we use showed this effect. And it has the hallmarks of being a rapid and abstract process. So first, it was rapid. People responded within 350 milliseconds. So that's an upper bound for how long it took. It was also spatially invariant. So it didn't matter, it didn't matter whether the guy was on the left or right. And it was relatively abstract. So even if the event category switched, the effect size was the same. So I think this is really exciting because it suggests that visual processing is extracting this role information in a rapid and abstract way, even when not required to do so. Of course, we want to rule out some alternatives. For example, that this effect is not just due to salient switches in posture. So you'll notice the agent has an active posture, patients have a passive one generally. So is it just because these things are switching? Well, we're going to ask that by doing one change to the images we had here. So we switch them so they're always facing away from each other. So now their postures are preserved, but the interaction element is reduced or eliminated. The prediction here is if this was just body posture, right, we should see the same effect as we did before. But if there's something about the relationship between actors, the effect should be reduced or go down completely. So here's the original images. Here are the amazing photoshopped images that we had. So the question is, the role switch cost reduced when the postures are preserved but the interaction eliminated. Here's the original effect. And here's when we make them not facing each other. So although we still see the effect, it's significantly reduced from what we saw before. And that suggests that this is not just due to salient switches in posture. We really think this is about automatically encoding something about the relationship itself. Oh, quick question? Yeah.
So this is fascinating. I wonder, did you do any eye tracking to see maybe they look at one of the actors before the other one, depending on who's the on or who's doing the thing, who's doing, who's the receiver?
It's an interesting question. We didn't do eye tracking. People responded within a few hundred, like 350 milliseconds here, which is really fast. Maybe it's enough time for one fixation. We have another study where we showed images super fast, like 37 milliseconds, and covered them up, and we find people can extract this role and event category information really fast, or at least from a fast presentation, suggesting that it's available from like a feed-forward pass-through visual system. It's a good question, though. Yeah. Other questions?
Just another question. Am I reading this right that the effect is only about 5 or 5.5 milliseconds?
You are not. That is correct here. The effect size itself is like a Cohen's d of like 1.5 or something. It's a pretty massive effect size, and almost every person or event shows this effect. But it's true that it's very small absolute size.
I'm not criticizing
Yeah.
for that. It's just hard to get the significant result of the reaction times, which have huge variables.
It's hard, yeah. So good for us, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, when we make the task explicit, which I've done in other work, like the effect is whopping, like 40 milliseconds, right? But that's not surprising because you're making them pay attention to that information. But in that case, it's a little unclear that then implicates an automatic process of the stimuli. Yeah. I'll take, yeah.
This is, since you've been interrupted, all of the examples you've given us are cases where a person is targeting the subject/agent. Does it work when you're asking them to, instead of the blue person, whichever the red person, have the one that they're looking for be the recipient?
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that, but that there was a lot of trials, and half the trials had the blue person as agent, half had them as the patient or recipient. Yeah.
And was it always like every case of giving is a case of taking? Every kind of
Interesting,
case
yeah.
of, leading is a case of
Yeah, so
telling,
there's
a
prospective
case of-
events, yeah. Yeah, we tried to avoid events where there was an ambiguity in role assignment for that reason, but those are all really interesting questions. Yeah.
So having an agent and a recipient is like a semantic thing.
Yeah.
And I can imagine like just sort of vaguely looking at paying attention to the task of blue, like which one side the blue on, and not paying attention too much to what's going on, and being much less difference. Whereas if you ask them every so often, was one person pushing the other?
We did exactly that.
Okay.
We actually, I don't have that here, but in our paper, that was actually, I think, the first experiment we reported, and the effect is bigger. So when you make them attend to the event information, even if it's just sparingly, it does make them like more attentive to the role information too. Great. All right, I'm going to move on if that's okay. Yeah? I can circle back. So in a final experiment, we asked just simply if this was replicable across stimulating tasks. So we had, now you press aside for the male individual, let's say, and we have these images of lots of different people doing lots of different actions. Now, despite all the variation in these images now of people and the scene, we still see the effect. Look at that, 2 milliseconds. But again, it's a strong effect size, so a lot of people in the experiment are showing the effect, right? And we can talk about why it's so small and stuff at another time. So summing up in this part, we asked whether the visual system rapidly and automatically extracts abstract relational structure, and we showed that even when people are just doing a simple color task or gender task, right, we find evidence that they're automatically, that the switches in the event role slows them down at that task. And they were responding fast, and the fact that it was not a task-relevant thing suggests it was automatic. And we found it across events, suggesting that it was a relatively abstract representation of something like an agent or a patient. So the answer to this question is yes. Now, I'll share another project. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so you brought up semantic, and so
Yeah.
I've been sitting here thinking this whole time also what you're saying, Professor, that it's super fast, right? Like less than 37 milliseconds, I think you said.
Yeah.
So just extraction is this thing that we do for natural scenes
Mm-hmm.
and memory, so semantic memory. But I'm not sure I see how this is different than that.
Yeah, I mean, so the natural scene category literature on just abstraction doesn't make as strong commitments to like the scene structure itself, as far as I understand it. People do that with like phase scrambled scenes, and you still, if that's strongly indicative of like a forest or a beach, you still get the category, right? This is making a sort of a strong commitment that you're extracting like the relationship between the individuals.
Yes, I think in natural scenes, the relationship is between, say, like the objects. So if you take away the global information that binds it, then you just extraction slows down substantially.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's the binding feature. It's a feel like that's what you're saying as well.
In that sense, I mean, the binding seems related. The fact that you're binding, say, like the structure to the object within or something.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a connection there. Thanks. Yeah, let's talk more about that. So, obviously we showed some abstract structure here in that we're getting agents and patient roles, but I'm going to push the envelope on that a little bit and ask whether we get abstraction for the relational category itself, apart from the filler objects that take place in that relation. And I'll examine another kind of relationship here, physical relationships between objects. And this is work with some of my advisors at Hopkins when I was a postdoc, Mick Bonner, Barbara Landau, and Chaz Firestone. And to start off, look at these objects. That's what I like to do, make you look at objects. When you put them together, they instantiate a relationship. In this case, some fruit that I don't know inside of a bowl. What is this? I don't know. Oh yeah, thanks. So notice that you can recognize that relationship across many different kinds of objects, right? Even unusual combinations of them, like this baby in a box. Unless you get lots of Amazon packages, I guess. So now, these images here have a commonality, one that distinguishes them from the images on the right, and that's the relationship. In on left, on right. Appreciating that commonality is a form of abstraction, understanding the relationship apart from the objects involved. The question here is, what is the role of visual processing in that abstraction? We're empirically going to investigate that by looking for a hallmark of abstraction, and that's generalization from one instance to another. For example, when we see fruit in a bowl, is there some sense in which we automatically process it so that it appears similar to the other examples of in and distinct from the examples of on? So here we ask whether relational similarity is so powerful that it can produce confusions between images, even across completely different objects and visual features. So to ask that, we put together a set of household objects. These are actually objects in a lab, but that's fine. And crucially, the pairs of objects appeared in both sets of relationships, containment and support, in and on. For each subject, we chose one of these images to be the target at random, and the rest were distractor images. And people's job was simple. Their task was to press one key if they saw this image, and a different key if they saw every other image. Crucially, notice that sometimes the distractor images matched the target's relational category, so in, and sometimes they did not. Now remember, the task is just, did you see this exact image? Even so, the question is, will people confuse distractor images for the target when it matches the category, even with different objects? So now you can get a feel for this yourself. Let's do another demo. I promise there's only 10 more of these. So what I want you to do is clap when you see this exact image and stomp for any other image. Just try it. Ready? All right, everybody practice. Clap. Woo! Ooh, I should just say clap, 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 applause. All right, here we go. Stomp. Yeah. All right, so I hope you found that pretty easy. So the subjects in our experiment also found that easy. They responded very accurately and quite fast, right? Second, you probably made few errors, right? But those errors are very telling. And we had a lot of subjects, so we could collect a lot of those errors. And with that, we can ask, will there be more confusions, false alarms, when the distractor matched the target's relational category, even when there were different objects involved? So here on the y-axis is the percentage of false alarms. Matches are when the distractor matched the target's category. Non-matches are when they didn't. And as you can see, we did find more false alarms when the distractors matched the target's category than when they did not. And as a reminder, this task was really easy. You just experienced it for yourself. But we still found that these rare events happen more often for the matches than the non-matches. And we think that the reason is because they're spontaneously encoding the relationship that they're observing in a way that's distinct from the objects instantiating that relationship. Now, one thing you might worry about is that this is just a useful strategy. So notice that when that was your target, knife and cup, sometimes the non-match had the same objects. So of course this makes it, because of the way the task is structured, useful to remember the relationship, to distinguish that target from this distractor. And that would cause our effect, right? So we eliminated that possibility by making one simple change. If that was your target image, you never saw this image at all in the experiment. And so now if you think about it, just remembering the objects here would be totally sufficient for performing the task. We want to ask, even so, can we still find evidence that you're spontaneously encoding the relationship of the objects? And what we found was similar to before. We found that people had more false alarms when the image matched the target's category than when it did not. So we don't think this is just a simple, useful strategy that we're causing people to have. We think this is truly spontaneous. There, I'll hang there for a second. Oh, when I hang there, I get questions, but yes, I love it. Yeah. I don't have it there. I believe this one was 200 people. It's online. The study's online. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, Jacob.
Just a comment on what you said. When you said it's not just a useful strategy, I mean, encoding relations is a useful strategy. You meant it's not just a trick that people are doing just for this stuff.
Yeah. It's not merely a useful strategy. It might be another way to say it.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a very useful strategy in nature. I mean,
That's true. I do think it's useful, and that's why we probably encode it spontaneously. Thank you for the clarification. I should change that title, yeah, on that slide. All right.
I have a question.
Oh.
The errors also in this is a if you have a big thing, you have a little thing, one can go inside the other. Were the errors all in cases where, like the on-ness relationships are not quite as evident, right? So you've got a small thing sitting on top of it. So I'm asking, are the matches and non-matches equally represented in the in-ness and the on-ness cases?
In this, you mean like just as good examples of in and just as good examples of on?
When the target was an on,
Yeah.
and your on cases were like a napkin on top of the box, maybe,
Okay.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Were the errors more often on, or mainly on the on-ness as opposed to the in-ness cases?
I don't think we found a specific difference between in versus on when that was your target, actually. Yeah. But I think there's lots to talk about, like how good does an instantiation of that relationship have to be for it to be like automatically encoded in vision or not. I think there's a lot I have to say about that, but I'm going to say that at the end. Yeah.
Good question. Was the data stationary across a run, or do you have anything thought that subjects might have been evolving their strategies?
We didn't
as they
find
saw
any
more?
block effects, right? Now that always could be that you just didn't have enough blocks or something, right? But that's another reason why I think it's pretty spontaneous. Yeah. Okay. So one last thing is that we aim, there could always be a lower level explanation. So notice that there's some lower level properties that distinguish in and on. So for example, in containment, you might notice a lot of diagonal contours that are not present in the on cases. So we address this by creating distorted versions of the images such that many low-level properties were preserved, but the relationship was not. So one of these was a standard technique called box scrambling. It's not the perfect control, but notice that if there's a diagonal relationship here, in the original, many times it's still present here, right? That diagonal there, and it's not there. And in the second control, we use something called diffeomorphic warping, where we just simply stretch the images a little bit as if it was on a sheet, like that. And that preserves most of the colors, textures, and sizes of the objects. You might even be able to tell like there's some any things here and on there, but it doesn't look like one thing in or on another. So these manipulations will let us ask whether the previous effects were due to these lower level things. If we see the same effect as before, it suggests that that's true, that it's just the lower level stuff. If we see the effect eliminated, that suggests there's something about the relational category itself that is causing the effect. And what we found is that there was no difference between the match and the non-match in this case, in either case here anymore. And that suggests that these relational confusion effects we saw before were not just due to these lower level features, although those things certainly contribute to recognizing categories. We think it's really about in and on per se, these relationships here. So to summarize, this study, I think, shows that visual system automatically processes relationships in this abstract manner. And together, finding evidence for structure and abstraction in visual processing suggests that visual representations have the property of role-filler independence, right? And that's a representational format that appears to be shared across vision and language. Now, the presence of such a format in visual processing suggests that visual representations may, in some cases, be compositional. And in this third part, I'm going to talk about the process of compositional representations in vision, specifically how this relational structure is built in the mind in a literal sense. And I'll tell you what I mean here. Oh, and this is work that I worked on with Zhe-Kun Sun and Chaz Firestone. And I want to draw attention to Zhe-Kun Sun in particular. She was my colleague at Johns Hopkins, and now she's a postdoc at Yale, and she's pretty awesome. So just remember that name and face. Or just the name, if you're reading job applications. Anyway, so what do I mean when I say that visual representations may be compositional? Well, consider how compositionality operates in other domains, like language, which you all know very well. So we understand a meaning of a sentence like "the cat is on the mat" by understanding the meaning of the individual components and then how those fit together in this schematic tree structure here. No commitments to this being the actual structure, it's just an illustration. So this sentence differs from a very similar sentence, "the man is on the cat," by virtue of the differences in where those parts go. The words are composing differently. So just as individual words combine to form phrases and sentences in language, a growing literature suggests that visual representation they contain discrete entities that compose in systematic ways. Oops. Well, you can't see here, but there would be that happening. Now, this finds echoes in prior literature that has investigated this for other kinds of foundational visual representations. So an example is from your own, Jacob Feldman and Manish Singh, right, who investigated the structure of shapes in terms of shape skeletons, which are you could think of as a way of parts going together compositionally. Our interest here was to explore the nature of this compositionality for visual relationships, and in particular what I will call the psychophysics of the compositional process, how these are built in time by the mind. So one possibility is that it happens all at once. So you see an image like this, it's on your retina, you get a retinal image all at once, and so likewise it's combined in your mind all at once. Here we explore an alternative to that. So we think that it might be possible that visual processing might build a representation of the relationship here sequentially over time. But if that's the case, then one object has to come first. Which one? As far as we know, this hasn't been asked before, but maybe that shouldn't be so surprising because it's a kind of question that only really makes sense if you think about visual processing of these things in a compositional way. In other words, we're asking in what order these objects compose. So here we take inspiration from an interesting idea explored by people studying the psychology of language, so people like Barbara Landau, Lila Gleitman, and many others. And the idea is that in a sentence like this, even though the cat comes first sequentially in the sentence, we actually interpret the sentence with reference to the object, the mat. That's sometimes called a ground or a reference object. So reference objects are generally those that are large, rectilinear, stable, physically controlling, and figure objects like the cat are usually small, mobile, and physically controlled by other objects. So the prior work I mentioned suggests that reference objects are primary in cognition. And on that perspective, a mental representation of a sentence, like the cat is on the mat, is such that there's a mat, and on the mat is the cat. Now, if that's right, then what about looking at an image of a cat? Do we represent it like that? Are reference objects also primary in visual processing, where we represent it as a mat, and on that mat is a cat? So to address this, we use what's called a sentence picture verification task. So in such a task, people read a sentence like the laptop is on the desk, and then they're asked to verify whether that matches an image that appears. So in this image, you'd press true, and for this, you'd say false. Now, our question is about compositional order, how these representations are built in time. So we made one key change to that standard paradigm. Instead of showing the image all at once, sometimes the reference object appeared right before the figure object, like this. And sometimes it was the opposite way. Sometimes the figure object appeared right before the reference object. The key here is that manipulating this order allows us to ask whether there's a privileged order for recognition. The idea is that if the mind is really building relational representations in this way, then it's almost like we're building the relationship for them in the way their mind would do it anyway. And if that's right, we should see that it's easier to verify the description in one case than the other. And based on that literature I mentioned from people like Barbara Landau and such, we expected to be an advantage for the reference first condition. This may or may not be the last demo. Please do it. So I'll present you with a sentence, and your job is to clap if it's correct and stomp if it's incorrect. And try to do it fast. All right? The laptop is on the desk. Good job. The plant is below the shelf. No, the plant is below the shelf.
Below is tricky.
Below is a little tricky, fine. The lamp is on the nightstand. Nice, okay. So, let's do one more. Why not? The table is supporting the vase. Good. All right. So maybe you already have a sense of whether it's easier in one case than the other. What about our participants? Will it be easier for them to do this task when the reference object precedes the figure object? So on the y-axis is reaction time for accurate trials. Sometimes people actually saw both objects at once, and they responded in around 750 milliseconds. And when they saw the figure object before reference, they were faster. But when they saw the reference object before the figure object, they were faster still. In other words, a majority of our participants showed this effect. As you can see, it was easier to verify the scene description when the reference object appeared before the figure object. That's a reference first advantage. Oh yeah, Ryan?
I have a quick question. So when you present them simultaneously, you're only getting one image before they react. So
Yeah.
do they have less time to think? Like, does having the two separate objects give them more thinking?
I think the reason you get this one faster than this is because you've sort of pre-segmented the objects for them,
Yeah.
which does help. But the important case is that you're faster when that one pre-segment appears before that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's certain you can think of different explanations why you might get that one higher. Yeah. Oh yeah.
The reaction time is measured from which image?
Onset of the second image. So for this one, it'd be the onset of both images. Yeah.
So that does the pre-processing.
Yeah, of that first object.
It's not included in the
Yeah, of the first object. Yeah, that's true. That's another reason. Yeah, exactly. And the effect was general, so it occurred for different pairs of objects, different kinds of relations, physical ones like something on something, but also spatial, like something below something. And it held whether the reference object appeared first or second in the sentence. So even if the reference object appeared second, or if it appeared first in the sentence, we saw the effect in both cases and there was no difference. And these results suggest that there's a reference first advantage in basic visual recognition of these kinds of scenes. Now, one question when you might be thinking, of course, is whether this is really like a visual process here. Well, we wondered that too, and so we made one change to the previous experiment. Instead of matching a sentence to an image, we just have people match a probe image to a target image. You see this image, and then you have to see if it's that one or not. So they saw the probe, it was masked, and then the rest of it was the same. We had one object precede the other. Like that, yeah. And we found the same effect as before, a reference-first advantage, even with a visual probe. And I think that suggests our effect is not just driven by the effect of comparing a linguistic stimulus to a visual one, but really something about comparing one visual thing. It's happening within visual cognition. Now, one final thing you might be asking is, like, what actually drives this effect? What is it about these objects? So notice that figure objects tend to be small and curvy, large rectilinear for reference, right? Is it just these visual properties that's doing the work? Or is it more sophisticated relational properties? So notice that the table is supporting the laptop, which is a physical relationship that's hidden in some sense. Our experiment couldn't distinguish these possibilities. So we ran one final study on this. We used the same paradigm as the original one, except now we replace them with identical objects that just differed in color. In these cases, the physical relationship between objects is what determines the relationship. So we have gravity and the reaction force. If I snap my fingers and make the red book go away, let's time it right, ready? I got it. The other one falls. So there's a supporting relationship, and it's one you can't see just by looking at the objects. It's not like a visual thing you can point to. So here the book would be reference, the red one, and the blue book would be figure. And once again, we predict a reference-first advantage here. Here, oh, you can try one trial. I think this is the last one. You don't have to clap or stomp, it's fine. But you can. The blue book is on the red book. Lukewarm. Yeah, so that is correct, but maybe it felt a little bit funny, right? Strange. The question is it easier when you get the red book before the blue book, the reference before the figure? And we see that again. And notice that this is not driven by differences in the objects themselves. It has to be driven by what I call a purely physical or relational reference-first advantage. So bringing it back to the question, what is the psychophysics of the compositional process here, and in particular its time course? I think what we did here suggests that the mind composes these relations sequentially, respecting the roles that these objects play in the relationship. Reference first, figure second. And I think these findings reveal something about the compositional process for relationships like these. Now, returning to the talk outline, I think taken together, these parallels really do suggest that language and vision share core aspects of representational content and format. Now, I know the talk said 45 minutes. I do want to just spend a few minutes talking about this last part here. It's a shorter part because it's really brand spanking new stuff. So it's about how these shared formats might reveal something about how we might acquire words and what kind of word meanings we can actually entertain as learners. More specifically, I think there's a real possibility that our non-linguistic representations of things like events in cognition and perhaps even in perception could constrain the kinds of meanings we can entertain for relational terms like verbs. Now, it's new, like I said, so I don't really have a full story of how and why, but I can share some thoughts on that. Now, we're going to take a first step to just exploring this by simply asking what kind of verb meanings learners find difficult to acquire. And in short, we think that if certain verb meanings can't be lexicalized due to certain psychological constraints, then trying to get people to teach these, to learn these, will be impossible. They won't be able to learn them. This, I should say, is work done in collaboration with my postdoc, Tyler Knowlton. He's great. And also that this work is just a couple months old, so your feedback is appreciated. So let's consider the problem a verb learner faces here. So in a sentence like this, you have to represent something about the event, right? In this case, perhaps how running looks or happens, right? But when you get an interaction between individuals, you really have to understand the nature of what's being described by understanding the distinct roles that the individuals play in this kind of event, right? And you also have to understand how those roles map to syntactic position. Otherwise, you might inadvertently interpret the event like this. Poor doggy. But of course, we know something about biting and what can take which role, and so we know it's something more like that other scene here, right? Now, this requirement poses a genuine learning problem. How does a learner know for each verb where each participant role maps to each syntactic role, subject and object? Well, one thing that can make that easier is if we had general roles like agent and patient. The stuff I talked about earlier suggests that we do. But even easier would be if there was sort of a systematic mapping of participant role to grammatical role. So agent to subject, patient to object. Now, many language acquisition theories assume some kind of syntax-semantics relationship, but generally without committing to a specific mapping between those two things, because we don't want to assume too much of the learner. So maybe they can represent the categories of these things, maybe how many there are, but we believe that might underestimate learners' knowledge. And you could think about that because, in fact, these mappings are systematic in language. So think of an event like a dog biting a man. Imagine a verb like spiting, which can describe exactly the same event, but for this particular verb, the roles are reversed. So agent goes to object position, patient goes to subject position. Well, clearly no inverse verb like this exists in the language, right? And neither do these ones. Schicking, schmitting, stapping, whatever verb you want, right? They don't exist in English. Now, this doesn't mean we can't express these kinds of meanings, of course, right? Like we can use the passive to say the man was bitten by the dog, but it takes a little extra work. Those kinds of meanings aren't baked into the verb itself. Now, certain... Oh.
I've got that slide up. You're just talking about a verb, a new novel verb like schicking.
Yeah.
You're not suggesting that there might be a morpheme, like the SH there, that is supposed to be a verification.
No. I'm just sort of being cheeky by having this just something, right? But yeah. That's an interesting point too. Yeah, there could be. I actually don't know enough, but there could be languages that have that kind of morpheme. I really don't know, but someone else can answer that question. So, of course, theorists capture this lack of inverse verbs by proposing that there is this kind of systematic mapping and trying to capture why that is, right? Now, while that typological work lays the foundation, important questions remain, namely, is this actually just a linguistic coincidence, a historical accident? So, a fact about the kinds of verbs that end up appearing in language for whatever reason, is there a sense in which this constraint is actually psychologically real? Something fundamental, a constraint in verb learning or in event representation. So to ask that, we're going to ask whether adults can acquire these inverse verbs. And of course, eventually we're going to get to kids and ask whether they can do it too. So to do this, we need sort of unambiguous events that convey roles. And Mashadi and causal launches are good examples of those. So when you get one object approaching another and causing it to move, people interpret the first as an agent, the second as a patient. Importantly, there's really no role ambiguity here, and it's really hard to interpret these events in any other way. So they're perfect for a targeted semantic hypothesis for verb learning. So to ensure people genuinely learning new verbs rather than just translating from English, we added fun manners to the agent, so like this. Wee woo woo woo. This too. Except there were no sound effects. We call this one bleeping, that one shorking, right? So people just had to learn these verbs. They saw these events paired with sentences, and over time they were supposed to learn what those verbs meant. And then we just tested them by asking, is a red circle gleaming a blue square? Yes or no? What do you guys think?
Was that one shorting?
That one was shorking, so no. Thank you. Good. You're a great subject. So half people saw the standard order that we have already, agent to subject, etc. But half of the participants saw inverse verbs. So they saw something like, for this, a blue square is leaving a red circle, where agent was mapped to object position and vice versa. The question is, will these people fail to learn these inverse verbs? So in addition to these causal events, we had a non-causal filler. So for these, order doesn't matter, so we expect groups to be about equal in how well they do. But for these ones, of course, the order, at least the mapping from like one type of role to the next, matters. So we predict that standard folks will be better than inverse, and that the inverse might even be at chance. Here you can try this yourself. This would be like what a standard group participant saw. Right? A red circle shortening a blue square. Here's what inverse people would see. A blue square is leaving a red circle. So you can sort of feel what that's like. So how did people do? So on the y-axis is how well people did. So on the filler, both groups did equally well. It was just as hard for both one and the other. And on the standard condition, those folks did just as well in the filler as on these causal events. But the inverse group people failed catastrophically. They just couldn't learn those verbs that we were presenting them, even though they could learn that filler group verb just fine. In fact, only 13% were above chance at learning those verbs of people, right? And I think this finding suggests that people have this expectation or even a constraint that agents should map to subjects and patients to objects. It's something in their heads. And they can't learn stuff that deviates from that pattern, at least not without a ton of effort. So I think we can rule out that this is simply a linguistic coincidence. It really seems like this is a psychologically real constraint in people's minds. Now, of course, you say, what about kids? And I'll say, great point. We plan to test that too, because that's where the real insight lies. But I think there's reason for optimism, at least on one end of the spectrum. So work by RuCCS's own Alan Leslie and Stephanie Keeble has shown that infants are sensitive to roles in causal events. And newer work from Luba Papeo, Jean-Remy Hochman and colleagues have found this for social interactions between individuals. So I think there's optimism there. Now, if we can assume that the constraint does exist, even for kids, the important question is how and why. And so we're just getting started. I can't answer that, but of course there's at least two possibilities. One is that it's a linguistic constraint. So there might be some rule in the grammar that says external arguments or subjects, take agents, internal, take patients. But my money is actually on another possibility, and it's why I'm telling you about this work on language here in a mostly vision talk. And that's what I think at the language cognition interface. So big if, but if there is a natural homology between non-linguistic structures and linguistic representations, then it could be that external arguments in one system might more easily map to those in another if they're in similar structural positions, right? And maybe hard or impossible when they're not, right? Now, I said that's a big if. There's a lot of questions that remain. We don't really know what the structure of these kinds of representations are. Are they hierarchical? What's internal? What's external? Does the mind prefer mapping between structural positions? You know, we don't know a lot of that stuff yet. But we're excited to explore those kinds of questions. So getting back, because it's almost time. In the talk today, I've made the case that language and vision share core aspects of representational format and content. And I discuss potential ways that sharing similar formats like this could constrain the way that learners actually acquire their language in the first place. That stuff's newer, and I don't have the answers yet, but it's something I'm excited to explore. So the connections between language and vision appear to go far beyond a shallower view that I discussed in the beginning, where vision just provides a lower level primitives for the rest of the mind to work with. Instead, I think it's much deeper, that visual processing outputs abstract structured relational representations in a format that is immediately accessible by higher level cognition, including language. Now there's tons of open questions. For example, what is the precise structure of LOT-like representations in perception? You know, what are the limits on the kinds of content perception can represent? You know, I don't want to say perception's doing exactly the same thing as language in all respects, but I think there's some important similarities. And of course, when do such representations arise in development? But I should end. It's about time. So I want to thank my collaborators here. Of course, my lab, especially Tyler Knowlton, who spearheaded that last part. And of course, thank you guys for listening. Hey, yeah. Yes, you.
Yeah, so thanks, that was really interesting. And I've been interested in this last part about whether the agent and object relationships are there, whether that's specific to language or whether that's part of more general cognition. And I think it's exciting that you're looking at that. Two-part question. One, do you imagine doing that like your figure ground kind of study where you have some kind of picture of an event and you drop in the theme argument first and they're faster, you drop in the agent argument?
That's great.
And before you answer that, let's
Okay.
look at the other one in case we're doing that. Certainly that the agent-theme relationships, you're going to get that in things that aren't visual at all either. Right, so you're talking about perception, but
Yeah.
then your examples were vision, but you could have things like, John insulted Mary, Mary insulted John.
Yeah.
You're going to get that asymmetry in language for things that aren't going to have obvious visual.
Yeah, I mean, good. I'll try to answer both in turn. So the first part, there actually is work already, not doing the exact task I've done and such, but providing evidence that there is some kind of advantage in processing events when you get an agent or you see an agent before a patient. So I think there is already actually some kind of evidence in that regard.
Isn't that the opposite?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, right? That's something I'm trying to wrestle with, is that in the figure reference, the laptop on desk thing, right? So we get an advantage for the desk, which canonically appears in the oblique or whatever position, but you get an advantage when it's first in vision, right? On the other hand, agents, you get an advantage, right? When you process it first in viewing an event, but it ends up external in subject position, right? And I would love to talk with anyone that would like to help enlighten me on why they think that might be, because I think it's really interesting tension in the kind of thing I'm talking about. Yeah.
And then about
Oh yeah, the second question was, yeah. So I sort of put that question aside when I'm doing this kind of work. By using events that have a pretty clear visual component to providing access to agent and patient concepts. Because it's a way to start this kind of work. But I think those questions about when there's sort of either less obvious role assignments for certain events, like insult, where there's not necessarily a visual correlate of it, or even stimulus experiencer type events, like scaring
I would say
somebody.
thinking of it in terms of abstract cause and effect. They're not; those aren't ambiguous kind of events. They're just not visual.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there's all kinds of cases where vision, automatic vision or whatever, is not going to get you there. It's not going to automatically afford a representation of the structure of an event. There's events that take place over larger timescales. Erosion. I don't think vision is going to give you any kind of information about eroding events, right? There's a limit to what vision can do, and just like in the in and on case too. I don't think vision can do every type of containment or support. In fact, Barbara Landa has all kinds of work on more extended versions of what she calls these force dynamic relationships that I think vision will have more trouble with, at least automatic vision. I think these canonical ones is the kinds of things that vision can do, but it's limited, right? And it's interesting to ask in those cases, well, how do you extract that relational information, right? Yeah.
So thank you so much, first of all, that was awesome. So I guess two things. First, to kind of maybe try to answer the kind of problem of people having a preference for perceiving the agent first in language, and also perceiving the reference first in vision.
Okay.
Maybe it's both of those positions are responsible for causality. The reference there supports the agent being on top of things. So without it, you wouldn't have that situation. Like it's like a precedent, and then similarly for the agent, like that is what puts in motion like an event or an action or something. So it's like that. It's more like a chronological precedent. Maybe?
Chronological. Interesting. That's cool. I like that. Okay.
Second thing I was thinking about was kind of going more specifically to the visual prepositions thing, like the on and in. Because I know specifically, like in German, they have like 3 different versions of the word on. Like there's a totally like vertical on, like the thing is on the table, or there's like the code is on the wall, like that's like sideways, and there's like another one I don't remember. But do you think that maybe people would who speak different languages that have different prepositions like that correlate to different visual relationships would have different like results with the visual perception?
My hunch is no in like these fast and spontaneous visual tasks. I think people will mostly perform the same. Like Barbara Landau's work, she argues that like there is sort of what she calls core versions of these relationships, like containment like that, and like support from below, right? Other people have said that too. For more extended versions of those, I think the ones that aren't automatically extracted, those are actually like on a hook. Code on a hook is a good example of one where in English we say code on a hook. Maybe other languages, they don't say that. They use even like a verb for that. Those are the ones that maybe are less amenable to automatic extraction. And I don't think there's going to be the case where like the language, it's just my hunch that the language you speak will dramatically change whether you get these kinds of effects or not. Like Korean has like loosely tight fit, loose fit. It's not really like that. People wonder if you would get a distinction between those and these kinds of tasks. I think you might, but also for English speakers. Oh. Okay. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I'm wondering if, for the purposes of figuring out how vision and language are talking to each other, it might be time for all of us on either side of that divide, particularly agent aside for a while. Because if you're thinking from the language side, the agent, as it gets used in the literature, kind of conflates a number of different things. One just being a brute causer versus being a sort of thing that's intentionally bringing about effect. For as much as people love to say you don't find the agent in object position, it's not true described that way, because you say dogs chase the cats. Very hard for the cats to get chased without being agented in the sense of moving around. So I think what we need is something sort of like the dogs initiated the events, except you know that the chase can get initiated by the cat leaping off the mat and luring the dog into chasing. Right? And so by the time we're throwing the notion of agent around in natural language symbols, right, there's a lot of stuff that's already going on. And nailing down what we mean by agent is actually notoriously difficult. Whereas your initial experiments look like they suggested a really nice correlation between, if you parse the scene in terms of objects, you know where the boy and girl is. And if, on the assumption of vision, these track causes and effects, there's a nice way of like locating a probable cause in that scene. Possible effect, and the cause is co-located with the boy and the effect of the girl. And it might be really just worth thinking about how the vision, if it's doing something like composing, where it's putting its causes and effects relative to a certain kind of population, and then asking how that plus lots of other stuff now feeds into a very complex agent, where when we say the dogs chase the cats, we find ourselves saying, yes, the dogs were the agents, and the cats weren't, whatever that means.
Yeah, I mean, I did call them agent and patient. I'm not committed to those being like, first of all, I don't want to say they're the exact thing, same thing that people talk about in like semantics or whatever in terms of agent and patient. I do think there is some notion in vision at least of like agent-like and non-agent-like. But I don't know how many splits there are or if there are splits. People in vision study whether you can perceive like animacy, intention, whether those are distinct from one another, as well as cause. And I don't know. And so they go together, they sort of cluster together as features, but when you have them teased apart, I don't know if that results in like distinct category representations, or if they're all just sort of a cluster of features that's akin to almost like to Dowdy's prototype roles. Yeah. Hard. Yeah.
So, I mean, just on that narrow point, obviously, visual people don't usually use the word in this way, but, you know, there is a lot of study of things like animacy of specific objects, but it's hard to convince vision people other than those who study that kind of thing that that's actually vision.
Yeah.
They always say, well, it's just cognition and language. So these debates come in hand in hand. But I had a different question, so just a response. So, you know, in terms of the sequence in which visual relations are computed, there's a long history of debate about not about the agent patient issue, but about whether individual elements of the visual scene are computed first and relations later, or the reverse. So the traditional assumption is that it was first you recognize little objects and then you compute relations later. But the empirical study of this has usually revealed the reverse. That you basically compute something called the gist first, which in your terms is essentially a relation, and then kind of fill in the specific objects later. So if you know there's an instance of omness before you know what the objects are.
Yeah.
So that's like an open finding in the visual perception. It doesn't really relate to the asymmetry between visual perception, but it does suggest that people are getting something like a large-scale spatial relation earlier. So, I mean, I guess the question is, how do you think that might relate to the finding?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if like the kind of work that people do on like spatial structure of a scene and like whether it's indicative of a certain category. So obviously that's relational in some ways, right? Like relationship between like, you know, surfaces and such, right? And potentially the objects within those. I think it might be a different kind of beast from these kinds of relations that I'm talking about here, but I think there probably is a relationship in the sense, like you said, like it's the fast stuff, the stuff you can extract super fast. I think it's a really interesting point, like get into, and I would love to actually ask you about that specific work, but I think it's very possible that what you do is you represent it almost like, you know, like essentially like as a object file without its content filled in over here, and an object file without its content filled in over here, the relationship between them, and then, you know, you can then bind to those things, like the category, let's say knife or cup or something. And that kind of process and form of representation would actually be pretty nice, because then you could get the relationship, even that there's an object here and there, even if you didn't yet get the category information, or couldn't because it was sort of an ambiguous object or something.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it relates to the asymmetry of the lines that you guys were discussing before. I mean, if the reference object in your visual relations is larger, like the way a place is larger than a thing, which is another distinction, that's, you know, neuroscientific distinction between places and things, then, you know, you could see the whole thing first, like the table or the room, and then see a laptop later or something.
Cool. Oh.
I was thinking the exact same thing, David.
Cool.
And I think, I'm coming from the neuroscience perspective, so apologies. So I think about the brain and visual processing. I think from the brain's perspective, it definitely looks relationships first. And it uses relationship information to figure out the more complicated things, what is the object. So in your experiments, which is beautiful, right? But I was thinking there's a third possibility that the subject first brings it on, and then decides how to place the objects. Maybe helps look for such an identical with the objects on. And that's kind of why I asked about the eye tracking thing.
Okay.
It might, whatever it is you do, but eye tracking could be cool to use to see how people are actually engaging with the stimulus, with the two people and the objects, to see if they're actually trying to get this information first. That might give the stimulus up in the brain, which is on the time scale that you have, right?
Yeah.
And your differences. So all of that kind of gets
Cool. I love it. Yeah, I love it. So one note about that quickly is that in that in-on study, so we did have the first version of the experiment where we did have that knife on cup if you had knife in cup. What we do find is that like you get massive false alarm effects for the objects themselves as well, much stronger than the relationship actually, which suggests that I don't know which is first or second, but the object information is certainly very powerful in the representation. But yeah, I don't know about the order itself still. Yeah. And in terms of gist, I mean, I would love to talk with you or whoever more, but like, my impression is that gist is sort of a loose term that sort of captures anything from like the forestness of a scene versus like the spatial envelope or openness or closeness, and some people even refer to it in terms of meaning like spatial structure of a scene. So there's a lot of variability there. So my first paper on this, I called it gist extraction for events, but I don't like that term as much anymore because I think the term gist it's hard to really know what people mean by it. Yeah.
I'm trying to get a sense of this sort of this. Every case of on is also a case of under.
Hey, sorry, can you say it again?
Every case of on
Okay, yeah.
is also
Yeah.
a case of under. So in the case of under, what is your prediction in terms of which is the thing one attends to?
This is great. Thanks for the question. So I think there's a certain way in which the visual scene biases you towards interpreting the scene in one way, and it's hard to interpret it another way. So, of course, you can conceive of like the laptop on the table, right? In terms of the laptop being under, or the table being under the laptop, right? It's a little harder to do that, I think. And I think there's a way in which the visual scene and the way that the scene is structured actually constrains the possible hypotheses you have of the scene, including that kind of interpretation, like your perspective on the scene, right? We did have one experiment, which I didn't talk about, where we have book, spatially separate. In those cases, actually, and in those cases alone, do we find an influence of the linguistic framing on our effects. And I think that's because there's work on this from like people like Steve Frankenary that shows that like those kinds of spatial relationships where there's not contact, there's not a social relation, actually take a little bit more effort and even like sort of sequential attentional routines to actually represent those things, right? Because you have to make a commitment about which perspective to take on that kind of scene. And like the supporting ones and such like that, I think the visual scene sort of affords that to you in a sort of automatic way, so you don't have to do that, and it's hard to overturn it. But in the thing where it's like
under is hard.
under, when you get like there's a spatial separation and there's
No,
a
I'm saying under. Is under harder than on? I mean, it seems like within your framework, I don't see why there would be a,
what I'm sort of saying is that I think that it's harder to interpret like a table with a laptop on it in terms of the laptop being like a referencey kind of thing.
what is under the table? What is on
Well, that's good. That's a good one. Yeah. Or cat is on the mat. Yeah. All right. I'll think about that more.
Just to follow up on that, I don't know if this would be helpful, but you mentioned very briefly that you got the same effect of, apart from the order. I think the computer's on the table and the table is supporting the computer.
Yeah, yeah.
We had that for a second, but it's sort of like Karen's reversing
Yes.
kind of cases. But in a way that could show the challenge of comparing linguistic compositionality with visual compositionality, because I suppose it's not an accident linguistically that the table is supporting the computer is the way that it is.
I think it's very related to that last part I talked about, actually, in terms of like inverse verbs. I don't know enough about this yet. I'm not a linguist, but I wonder to the extent there are such things as inverse, prepositions. Of course, there are in some ways, right? Like above, below might be that way. I don't know. But like,
It does seem like these figured ground things are malleable in that way. The locative kind of things you can have to do either way, but the real agent-patient
yeah.
ones you can't.
But for the force dynamic relations, those physical ones, I think there might be a distinction, right? So I think above, below, over, under, those are the spatially separate kind of things. But from on, right, or in, I'm not sure if actually that kind of inverse meaning is lexicalized in that way, where you could reverse the figure reference. It might be. I don't know enough about this across languages, but in that case, I think there is a connection to the question from before, which is to do that kind of reverse framing, you have to actually use a verb, not a preposition, right? The laptop is on the table, but to say switch those in terms of the syntactic positions of the objects in a sentence, you actually have to use a verb to do it. The table is supporting the base. which I just think is an interesting fact that I think is connected. Yeah. Sorry, I'll get to you guys.
So I think the comments on this helped to maybe get at a question I had about that first experiment with the blue guy and the orange guy, which is I was wondering how much it is about the relation between the event participants or the semantic role of that individual participant. And so I was wondering about scenarios where it's not necessarily about the switch from being the agent acting on a patient to being a patient being acted on, but if you had other scenarios where, say, the guy in the blue was maybe doing some kind of reflexive thing like hugging himself or like, you know, patting or hitting himself, and the other individual, the other event participant didn't have any causal relation or any connection to him, or if they were both agents performing actions kind of in parallel, like in spatiotemporal contiguity with each other. So if you, in your experiment, it seems like you switched from agent acting on patient to patient being acted on by another agent. Do you have a sense of like what to predict if you changed it from that to any of these other?
Yeah.
Where you're still the agent, but having a different relationship between the event participants.
Yeah, I did talk about it in terms of like the target's role switching, but it is true that you could also describe it as the event structure is changing, like the roles of both participants are switching, right? I'm doing it by target because it's like that's the one you're searching for and like looking for before you press the button, but you know, I don't know, like, or what about like an event like the guy is like getting wet. I'm trying to think of a good example, like melting. The guy is melting, right? So now what is the status of his role in that kind of event? Yeah, I think maybe that method can help answer that kind of question. Yeah.
Thanks so much. This was fantastic. So this is a kind of big picture question, and you might just say like needs a lot of further investigation. But I'm really interested in this question that I think came up toward the end of your talk and in some of the questions, which is what's the relationship between the abstract relations that are represented in perception and those that are represented in cognition and the language of thought, and then also in natural language? And one thing you mentioned was a scope question, like how, you know, among all the various abstract relations we represent, how many of those can get into vision? And that's a cool question. But then there's also this kind of narrower question about like the ones we have evidence for that you've shown us, like in and on. Are those the exact same abstract relations in and on in vision that we have in cognition? And I guess the kind of obvious answer is like yes, like you've shown us evidence that seems like the same thing. But you might think like the symmetry difference between, you know, which ordering to an advantage might make you think, no, maybe there's something slightly different about these relations. Or you might think in vision we have like a proto version.
Yeah.
So I'm just
I think
curious how you're thinking about that.
That's good. I'm sort of with the third thing you said, which is maybe there's sort of like a proto version of, say, cause or agentness, non-agentness, or inness, honest. I don't think that there's a perfect like copy, let's say, of like the perceptual representations of cognition. I don't think that that's how it would work. I think that there's just sort of like maybe there's just like a really strong mapping between like the proto version of this thing and then like these higher level ones that end up in cognition. So, example, people like John Kaminsky who study like infants' development of causal understanding have shown that like you get sort of distinct representations of causal events, but somehow we unify all of them in cognition. And so like how does that actually end up happening? So I think there's sort of a very abstract representation of cause in cognition, and it might be sort of more specific examples in perception.
You mentioned something I've had earlier about the tight fit, loose fit distinction.
Oh yeah, you like.
And I was like, yeah, I had to express some inhibition. It's very difficult for me. But yeah, so what you said at the very tail end, and you expect to see something not just for Korean speakers but for English speakers too.
Yes.
So I want you to unpack exactly why
Great.
you think that and what that means about like language and grammaticalizability.
Cool. Yeah. So, well, there's like the early work by Hespos and Stalky showing that infants are sensitive to something like this tight-loose distinction. And there's like a paper by Norbury, Wax, and Song, actually. If people don't know it, they should look it up. Because in the Hespo-Spelke work, they were trying to show that adults sort of no longer had that sensitivity. They're almost like, you think of it like as a semantic pruning or something. But through careful methods, Norbury, Wax, and Song showed that like if you present the events in sort of the right order, you get like sort of tight fit sort of induces like the strong feeling or representation of containment, such that like it's a different beast from like a loose containment. But presenting them in the opposite order, loose fit doesn't really evoke a strong representation of containment, at least of the same kind as the tight fit one. They might just be different beasts, right? And that's what I'm saying, like I think if you did perceptual tasks, it's possible you would get this kind of distinction that even with English speakers in a way that even if they're describing it, they can use the same terminology on or in or whatever to describe both. Yeah, there's something very special about tight fitness. I've done some work actually on numerosity judgments on like shapes that fit together very tightly versus ones that don't. I think it's a very special kind of relationship that exists, and you might not get that if you just looked at, say, English speakers, who generally talk about them in a similar way, although not always.
I was wondering if this taps into something that's like some kind of cognitive primitives that are maybe in the language of thought are like totally universal and innate, and those are like the things that are available to be grammaticalized across languages.
Yeah, maybe there's like a set of things that can be grammaticalized or lexicalized that some of those things are and some aren't. You know, language packages information in different ways, but I think that there's a constraint on those things that they can package and maybe they don't as much, right? Yeah.
So the vast majority of languages are subject to mission.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, Tom Beverly, 55 years ago, argued that kids have, and people, have a first noun and first agent. And if the vast majority of languages are subject to neutral, and I'm going to call on the French to give me the number. I think it's only over about 80%, 85%, something like that.
70%.
Okay, somewhere, it's you know, more than it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would argue most people are languages aren't so good, but, and at least ones I'm looking at seem to like subjects. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, all right. Anyways, you know, I guess I'm sort of asking you, you know, do you think you've come up with a reason for that? I mean, why?
Yeah, I want to be hesitant to tell. I want to be hesitant to tell just so stories.
Okay.
I think it's easy to just say, oh, like, you know, syntax is this way because of, like, you know, the elephant getting its trunk or something. I just mean, like, you know, you can always describe a phenomenon and try to explain it in terms of something else. I don't know exactly what kind of evidence we'll need to, like, make the kind of stronger claim I'm trying to explore, which is that the constraints of...
I'm trying to help you get around the problem that some of your patient results seem to contradict your other results. So I'm trying to get you there.
Thanks.
I'm not saying I got you there.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, there's definitely like an agent preceding, or like a subject preceding object bias across world languages.
Yeah.
You see that come up like in lots of kinds of studies,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
pantomime and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm trying to figure out is why it's interesting that like the figure ground one seems to fall, like if what we were saying earlier was true, that when you do process the math before cat, the way you showed it on screen, it looks like it follows like the derivational structure, the building the structure, you know, from the inside out, from the bottom up.
Yeah.
But then the subject or the agent one's like the opposite. It's
Yes,
more like
that's why it
it's more like the parsing order.
Yeah.
And like those are very different things. And so I'm trying to figure out why that would be true. And you're
Well,
kind of very
maybe,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've been trying to think about how much evidence for perception of relations versus language-like structure. I guess one of these kind of universal parallels. Just because I was thinking about, it seems like, for instance, perception of faces is a kind of predicate relation.
Is it, sorry?
Perception of faces is a kind of, or perceiving human shapes or something like that, involves predications behind, but you might think that higher dimensional space is supposed to be kind of those kinds of cases. So I guess I was just wondering, could I have like a really complicated view in which there's like higher dimensional spaces using all analog stuff is supposed to be, you could handle some of these. I guess the way to frame this is like, here would be some kind of evidence that would be really dramatic that there's a language like, with representations that are a lot like language, logical operators. But predication, the kind where like, two-place predication, you might think, oh, I just have to make my analog story more complicated in the kind of way. So I guess I just wanted to hear about like this relation between the kind of how much evidence for relations is going to push us towards a language argument, as opposed to just more complicated.
I guess it's a question of if you can capture, like, I'm trying to like explore that, and if there's a way of capturing it with that kind of representation, then that's not in this kind of format. I would like to hear it so I can think about ways that I can test that, right? Because I can't think of how exactly that would work, I think this is sort of a more parsimonious account, that it's this kind of format, because of the way that our results have fallen out. But if there was another way to capture it, we should test it.
I do think that your ordering effects kind of push it.
I don't know how long we can. I'll be here for another 5 hours, but.
I think a lot of it has to go change.
Oh, okay. I guess one final question.
So in your lesson of experiments, you have this one thing that's doing these motions and then touches another one.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like the other one has any effect on what's happening, other than being a target.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, are there things that are the opposite, where the cause is the static one? So like a magnet, or a vacuum cleaner sucking in a hairball. and if the thing about it is you have like this normal experience of things, then you have these somewhat unusual things. If you were to somehow make people remind people of those kind of things, would it change how they whether they could get that reverse order thing?
I doubt that just telling people like, oh, interpret this second object as the causer or like the initiator of the event.
Yeah, well, if you just say it like that, it probably won't make.
Oh yeah, I mean like in plain English.
If they had a story about those kind of things before you started.
Would you even need that though? Because what you're describing, if you just saw the ball go, I feel like you would interpret that as like an attraction event.
Yeah.
Well, it attracts, but you can also have one where the thing has initial momentum and so it doesn't go in straight, right? Like a penny rolling down one of those things.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'm kind of wondering whether you've got these sort of pre stories about what you're seeing that somehow the visual system is activating, and that's part of what's going on.
Pre-stories?
Yeah, like your brain's not that fast, right? So it's got to be able to get to where it's going fairly quickly. And I'm kind of wondering if in your experience, you say, oh, things act on other things. Oh, like some agents have intentions. All these things, and so you may have more than one interpretation of the scene going on, and one wins out in the end how you think it. You're sort of on these pre-existing stories. You're activating several of them, and then it narrows down, as opposed to you're analyzing from scratch.
Yeah.
And you're saying this is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, for people who do work on like causal perception, like the classic Mashadian launching is like a thing that people use all the time, and there's evidence of like after adaptation after effects using those kinds of events, suggesting that there's like something like a cause detector somewhere early on in the visual system for these kinds of things. So I think that like this is a very special kind of event. It's a very limited one, but it's one that can make things look kind of surprising. If you saw like some random thing on the screen moving, and then all of a sudden it would be surprising because like it's on the screen, but you can't help but see it that way.
Right.
I think there's a limit to what you can make inferences after the fact about what kind of event it is, and like reinterpretations of like the thing you saw, but I think you can't really override like the percept itself. And so, in terms of like changing what you see based on like knowing about the kinds of events that exist in the world.
Well, how narrow is that pre-existing expectation?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, we should probably stop. Thanks.
Thank you.